Good morning all. The module title is Cognitive Neurophysiology. I am Dr. Simran Kaur, Assistant Professor in Department of Physiology at AIIMS, New Delhi. So, what are the specific learning objectives of this module? The main specific learning objectives are the student should be able to define cognition and enumerate the cognitive domains. Second, he should understand the processing of sensory information, the stages of processing, serial and parallel processing pathways which lead to dorsal and ventral association cortices. Third, you should be able to enlist the functions of association cortices. You should be able to enlist main cognitive function tests for each of the domain, and you should be able to enumerate the conditions wherein the assessment of these cognitive domains are required. So, what is cognition? So, cognition consists of perceiving, attention, memory, knowledge, or is it solving problem, reason, decision making, or language? So, cognitive psychology is the scientific study of the thinking mind and is mainly concerned with how we attend to and gain information, how the information is processed and stored by our brain, and thirdly, how we solve problems, think and formulate language. So, according to Ulrich Nieser, cognitive psychology is defined as it refers to all the processes whereby the sensory input is transformed, reduced, elaborated, stored, recovered and used. So, this definition was given by Nieser in 1967. Now, there exists a total range of psychological processes from sensation to perception to action. So, which includes various cognitive domains. So, what are the main cognitive domains we know of? Predominantly it includes perception, which is involved with the detection and interpretation of sensory stimuli. Then we have something known as pattern recognition, that is, in day-to-day lives, rarely stimuli are perceived as a single event, but it consists of a complex pattern of sensory stimuli. Then we have all know the most important cognitive domain is attention, which is the selection of a behavioral relevant information from our sensory environment. Then consciousness, which is defined as the current awareness of the external or the internal circumstances. Then the memory, which is defined as the capacity to retain information over time. Then there is a representation of the knowledge, which is imagery, language, thinking and concept formation. In fact, recently artificial intelligence, it also forms a part of representation. Now, if we talk about the core concepts in cognitive neurophysiology, these can be addressed in 4 parts. A. Mental representation. B. The stages of processing. C. The hierarchical systems, and D. The cognitive architecture. Now, we will be dealing with each of these topics subsequently. So, what is mental representation? It is an unobservable internal code of information. Thereafter, the information processing can be linked to a series of stages. So, cognitive psychology has often been compared to a computational aspect in terms of the level of processing, wherein the input is compared to receptive function, storage as learning memory, processing as thinking, and output being the expressive function. So, all the brain circuits are actually circuits and they can be understood in terms of the computational methods. So, information processing model, it consists of series of stages which represent each stage and the flow of information from one stage to another. So these three diagrams actually tell you about the different stages and the inflow of information. Now going on to the stages of processing. The cognitive functions are mediated by specialized area of neocortex distributed along the cerebral hemisphere in an orderly arrangement. So identification of the functions of the cortical areas require characterizing the behavioral conditions under which its neurons are electrically active. So by means of a single neuron recording, this has been accomplished, and we have to determine its anatomical connections with the other areas, which can be studied by means of the neuroanatomical tracers. So within each sensory system, be it visual, be it auditory, signals from periphery, they arrive at a primary sensory area, such as primary visual cortex V1 in case of visual system, or primary auditory cortex A1 in case of auditory system, or maybe S1, which is the primary somatosensory cortex. Now processing also takes place in a parallel pathway. So if you have a look at this diagram in visual system, two parallel pathways terminate in different higher order areas of cortex, the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. So the dorsal stream processes spatial information in terms of position, motion, speed, and projects to the parietal association cortex, whereas the ventral stream processes information about form, color, shape, texture, and projects onto the temporal association cortices. So the primary motor areas have direct connections with specific muscles for causing a discrete muscle movements. Now we all know that the primary sensory areas, they detect specific sensation, be it visual, be it auditory, or be it somatic, and these are transmitted directly to the brain from periphery sensory organs. Now the secondary areas make sense out of these signals in the primary areas. In late 19th century, Santiago Ramon Cajal, he proposed that the areas within the sensory functions were fundamentally distinct from those with the cognitive functions. So he called the latter part, those with the cognitive functions, as the association cortex. Now modern neuroscientists apply the term association cortex to the regions of the cortex wherein the injury causes cognitive deficits, which cannot be explained by the impairment of the sensory or motor functions alone. And also they receive and analyze signals simultaneously from multiple regions of both the motor and the sensory cortex, as well as from the different subcortical structures. Thus, if we talk about their main function, it is integrative abilities. So to name a few areas of association cortices, first is the parieto-occipito-temporal association cortex, which deals with the spatial coordinates of body, language, naming objects. Then we have prefrontal association area, which works with working memory. Then the limbic association area, which deals with behavior, emotions, and motivation. The frontal association area, which causes the execution of behavior. The orbito-ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which also deals with emotion and motivation. So now this is the diagrammatic representation of the same. So this diagram shows most important association cortices. Now if we talk about the cognitive abilities, the main function of the cognitive neurophysiology is the hierarchical system, which is the parcellation of one goal into smaller sub-goals. So if I give you one example, the cognition, it is divided into perception, memory, and motor output. Memory itself can be divided into sensory, short term, and long term. Now again, long term can be divided into declarative and non-declarative, and so on. So there maintains a certain hierarchy. Now all these encompasses cognitive architecture, So, cognitive architecture specifies the underlying infrastructure for an intelligent system. These typically include short-term and long-term memories that store content about the beliefs, goals and knowledge, the representation of the elements that are contained in these memories, and their organization into a larger scale mental structures. The functional processes that operate on these structures, including the performance of an individual, the mechanisms that utilize them, and the learning mechanism that alter them. So, this is the diagram which explains the connections of all the areas from input to output. So, now coming to the area which is more interesting and application based, that is, how do we assess cognition? So, the mental activity variables, these are the most important thing before you actually administer any questionnaire. So, they are defined as the behavioral characteristics that affect the efficiency of the mental processes. They can be further divided into three categories. A, the consciousness, which concerns with the level at which the organism is receptive to stimulation. Now, the level of consciousness may range from full alertness through drowsiness, somnolence, stupor to coma. Next important aspect is attention, which refers to the different capacity or the processes of how an organism become more receptive and may begin processing information. Then lastly, the activity rate of an individual, that is the speed at which the mental activities are performed and the speed of the motor responses. So, Paget listed 4 important factors which influence the cognitive behavior. So, these 4 factors are: first, the maturation of the nervous system; second, the experience; thirdly, the social transmission of information; and lastly, the equilibration, which means the innate tendency of an individual for mental growth to progress towards stable and complex levels of organization. So, these are the main components of cognition. The main cognitive processes which should be kept in mind for assessment are: first, the encoding, which means the process by which newly learned information is attended to and processed when first encountered. Second is maintenance, the maintenance of the encoded information which we already encoded. Third is the manipulation, which is adding to or deleting from the items in the buffers. And lastly, the retrieval, which refers to the processes that permit the recall and use of the stored informations. Now, why is it imperative to assess cognition? So as to quantify and understand the underpinnings of the neural network. Now, human beings are both victims as patients and beneficiaries of the cognitive domains. So, as to learn about the more cognitive processes, we can develop better human machine interface, we can diagnose and prognosticate some diseases, and recently one more application of cognition is cognitive rehabilitation. So, how do we assess cognition? 4 primary considerations should be kept in mind before one plans to assess cognition. First, we have to assess the cognitive processes that are relevant. Then the test should be sensitive, we should validate it and employ measures using in other studies so as to facilitate the comparison. So, we have to ensure everything, because the most important thing is that the one size does not fit all. So, there is no specific cognitive function test which can be implemented to all. So, validate it, keeping in mind the demographic biases. Remember that you may have low accuracy for mild condition, so it is purely need based. So now cognition can be assessed using clinical history, questionnaires, cognitive function tests and the electrophysiological studies. So what in history? So we can actually record the symptoms of changes in memory, in attention, in language, in the visuospatial abilities, impaired executive functions or the emotional dysfunction. So going on to questionnaires. Standard questionnaires are available like MMSE, HMSE, PANAS questionnaires etc., which can be used to assess specific cognitive domain or the emotive domain in case of PANAS, which assesses the mood. Now these questionnaires can be drafted with respect to a specific patient population as well. For example, for the patients of schizophrenia cognition rating scales are present. But when one has to draft a questionnaire, following points should be kept in mind. First, you administer that draft questionnaire. Second, you validate the same in the control population. Third, you collect the subjective responses pertaining to each question. Next, then you assess the quality of the question based on the responses. So you should always go back. Next, now understand how the questions are interpreted by control population. Do pilot survey, reassess and then administer yet again. Again reassess and then finally administer in the patient population. So now if we talk about the next level, which are the cognitive function tests, there are innumerable tests which are present which can be targeted onto specific cognitive domain. To cite an example, this table depicts some of the cognitive function tests according to the domain involved. So if perception is involved, we can do visual perception, auditory perception, discrimination, color perception, color to figure matching, so on and so forth. In case of orientation, it can be elicited with respect to history in the orientation in time, place and person. It can also be elicited using body orientation, the topographical orientation on the prominent cities on the map. Then attention can be judged through reaction time, trail making. The short-term storage capacity can be assessed through digit span, sentence repetition. Working memory can be assessed by giving a spelling or common sequences or N-back test. Interference can be assessed using Stroop. Memory can be assessed using Benson bedside memory test, Weschler memory test, and verbal functions and language can be assessed via verbal fluency, concept formation and reasoning. So there are innumerable tests which can be administered with respect to specific domains. So like now executive functions can be done using maze test, star test, use of objects and alternative use test. The motor performances can be elicited by finger tapping test, hand dynamometer test. So these are the tests which are available and there are many more. Before you actually design a test, let us suppose there is an exemplary performer. So we have to keep in mind the domain to be assessed, the demographic profile of the subject, you have to validate frequency of administration, the performance measure, the difficulty of the test, the importance, and if at all it is required to be broken up into various steps. So depending upon the test, where to administer it, whether it is at laboratory, bedside, at home, at hospital, tasks they can be administered using paper pencil or they can be designed using computer software. Now the basic information before you actually design any software based tests are as follows. Firstly, you have to give a startup information. So this can be used to welcome the subject, highlighting the type or the name of the test. Then the instructions. These will be based depending upon the type of the test, the duration of the test, and related to how you perform the given test. Then you have to specify the number and the type of stimuli, which can actually give us the total number of the stimuli. Then what is the pattern of projection of stimuli? Whether it is auditory, visual, it can be both audio, visual, it needs to be mentioned. Then the specific duration of each stimuli, it has to be actually considered before actually implementing a test. We have to make sure that the total time of the test is appropriate according to the target population. So you should also specify the number of cycles, the total number of trials for each test, and then the response type. So you should mention how the responses are taken, whether you are taking responses through key presses or the response pad or the mouse. So now there is always a dilemma whether we should use these batteries or not. Yes, we can use them, provided we have assessed the psychometric properties of the reliability, the validity of the test. We have used standardized procedure which actually permits the comparison of one patient to another. Even if the test is actually tested by different clinicians. It covers a wide range of cognitive functions and behavior. But the only issue raised pertaining to the usage is, since they are subjective, thus keeping in mind the clinical scenario, the clinical profile of the patient, and collaborating it with the electrophysiological techniques like EEG, which is electroencephalography, or the event related potentials, which is ERP, or using fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. These techniques can actually help to understand the underpinnings of the neural network and may be used using various software. So the cortical sources, the milliseconds to millisecond change in the brain topography to the best of the temporal resolution can be done using EEG and spatial resolution using fMRI. So with this, I would like to summarize my lecture. Point to be remembered is cognitive neurophysiology includes total range of psychological processes from sensation to perception to action. Then there are certain core concepts which includes the mental representation, the stages of processing, the hierarchical system, and the cognitive architecture. Thirdly, it is important to assess cognition so as to quantify the underpinnings of the neural network. Now, this is important to learn about the human-computer interface, diagnosis and prognosis of a disease, and for cognitive rehabilitation. Now, cognition can be assessed using clinical history, symptomatology, the questionnaires, the cognitive function tests, and the electrophysiological tests, which are EEG, ERP, or fMRI. So, before assessing, all the variables known to affect the cognition should actually be kept in mind. So, the learning resources for the particular lecture is A. The Principles of Neural Science from Candle, B. The Neuropsychological Assessment by Lizak, C. Genong Review of Medical Physiology. Few citations have been taken from PubMed. The images have been redrawn or taken from freely available sources. So that is all from my side. I wish you happy reading. Thank you.